She entered the training grounds quietly, a woman who did not belong to the world of polished uniforms and hardened faces, and yet there she was, standing among recruits who had spent their whole life. Her clothes were plain, her posture calm, and when the others noticed her, laughter rippled through the group like a wave breaking on rocks. They whispered that she must have lost her way, that she had wandered into the wrong place, or worse, that someone was playing a cruel joke by letting her stand in line with them. The men, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, smirked openly, while some of the women recruits exchanged pitying glances, as if to say this stranger would not last a day. But she did not flinch, did not shrink under their amusement. Instead, she looked at the training yard, at the tall commander pacing with a stick in his hand, and her gaze was steady, almost unreadable. The commander, used to sizing people up in a heartbeat, barely glanced at her before focusing on the drills, convinced that whatever reason had brought her here, it would be over by nightfall. When the horn sounded to begin the first round of exercises, the recruits sprang into motion. Push-ups, sprints, grappling holds. Dust rose from the ground, sweat darkened uniforms, shouts of effort filled the air. The woman moved without hesitation, and though her form looked simple, even unremarkable, there was a fluidity in the way she carried herself. But the others were too busy mocking to notice. They jeered when she stumbled in the mud, they laughed when her hair loosened and fell across her face, they called her fragile, weak, soft. She ignored them. She finished every task without complaint, her breath steady, her eyes fixed not on them but on the horizon as if measuring something greater than the moment. Hours passed and fatigue began to wear on the recruits, yet the simple woman's rhythm never faltered. Her silence unnerved a few, but still the jokes came louder, bolder, as in the sparring rounds. Names were called, pairs faced off, fists struck flesh, and the sound of bodies hitting the ground echoed like drums. When her name was spoken, the crowd erupted in laughter once more. She stepped into the ring barefoot, her expression calm, her frame seemingly no match for the muscular recruit chosen to face her. The commander allowed it with a smirk, thinking a quick defeat would send her away. The recruit lunged, fast and arrogant, and for a moment everyone thought she would collapse. Instead, her body twisted with such precision that the man's strike cut only empty air. A second later he was on the ground, staring up in disbelief as she had used his own momentum to topple him without effort. The laughter faltered. Some clapped mockingly, insisting it was luck, but others shifted uneasily. Match after match she did not falter. She did not win with brute force, but with balance, timing and an uncanny ability to read her opponent before they moved. Sweat dripped down faces around her, yet she remained composed. By the time the sun began to dip, no one was laughing anymore, though their pride kept them silent. Then, at the end of the day, the commander called for a final test. "Shirts off," he ordered, for the recruits were to run the obstacle course without hindrance. The woman hesitated only for a moment before complying, pulling her plain tunic over her head. Gasps rippled instantly across the yard. Etched across her back, dark and sharp against her skin, was a tattoo unlike any they had ever seen, an intricate crest of wings and fire, the mark of a warrior clan thought long and in legends that instructors themselves spoke of with reverence. The commander, a man who had faced battles and storms, froze mid-step, his eyes wide, his face paling as if he had seen a ghost. His stick fell from his hand into the dust with a dull thud, and for the first time that day silence fell so heavy it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The simple woman stood with her back exposed, not hiding, not boasting, simply allowing the truth inked into her skin to speak for her. The recruits who had laughed now stared in stunned disbelief, and the commander, trembling slightly though he tried to mask it, stepped forward slowly, his voice rough when he finally spoke. Did you get that mark?" The woman did not answer at first, standing there with her back bared to the setting sun, the tattoo glowing faintly as if the ink itself carried some hidden fire. The silence stretched long, and the commander's question hung in the air, unanswered yet deafening. The recruits, who only hours earlier had mocked her as an intruder, now watched with a strange mix of fear and fascination, whispering fragments of old stories they had once dismissed as campfire myths. The commander stepped closer, his boots grinding in the dirt, his face a mask of disbelief and memory, for he had seen that very crest once before, not on the battlefield but in the war records of a campaign that had nearly broken the nation. Only the fiercest warriors, the shadow-born fighters of the Forgotten Order, bore such a mark, and their existence had been shrouded in mystery after the wars ended. "Answer me," he demanded, his voice sharper this time, but there was an undertone of unease as though he already feared the answer. Slowly she turned her head, her eyes catching his, calm but piercing. "I was born to it," she said softly, her words carrying weight heavier than steel. Murmurs rippled through the recruits. Born to it? That would mean she was not simply a pretender who had stolen a symbol, but an heir of the bloodline itself, a direct descendant of the very warriors who had once decided the fate of empires. The commander's throat went dry, and for a moment he thought of ordering her off the grounds, banishing her before questions grew too loud, but another part of him, the part that remembered the savagery of those legends, knew that was impossible. She had revealed enough in her movements during training to prove she was no fraud. The tattoo was not mere decoration. It was a seal, a claim, a reminder that her lineage had not vanished as history had been taught. He clenched his fists, trying to regain authority over the situation, but his voice betrayed him when he barked, "The mark is forbidden, it belongs to a dead order." The woman only tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, then spoke words that made the air seem to shiver. "Dead to you perhaps, but not to those who carried its fire in silence." Her tone was neither defiant nor boastful, but resolute, as though she spoke a truth carved in stone. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier arrogance dissolving into the raw realization that they might be standing in the presence of something far greater than themselves. One of the younger men, unable to contain his curiosity, whispered, "Who are you really?" Her gaze swept over them, calm as ever, and instead of answering directly she turned back toward the commander. "You invited me here," she said, "though you did not know it." That statement made his stomach tighten, because deep inside he wondered if it was fate or worse, destiny, that had led her steps into his camp. He thought back to the sealed documents in the archives, the stories of warriors who vanished to protect something unseen, and the quiet warnings that if ever the mark appeared, the world would change. His pale face hardened, though the unease in his eyes remained. "You will explain yourself," he ordered, trying to recover his tone of authority, but it sounded less like a command and more like a plea. The woman lowered her shirt once more, covering the tattoo, and for the first time her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not mocking but knowing. "In time," she replied, "but not because you demand it." That simple refusal, spoken without anger yet with undeniable finality, unsettled him more than any shout or rebellion. Around them, the recruits remained rooted in place, no one could speak above a breath, for they had seen the commander's presence eclipse the pride of the camp. In that long silence, the dust settled, the day's heat cooled, and everyone understood that the arrival of this so-called simple woman was not an accident but the opening of a story much larger than their training ground, a story written not in ink or rumor but in the living fire of the tattoo etched across her back. That night, the camp was restless, though no one spoke openly of what had happened. Whispers floated through the barracks like shadows, but the recruits avoided saying her name aloud, as if doing so might summon something they were not ready to face. The simple woman, however, slept quietly on her cot at the far end of the hall, her breathing steady, her presence strangely calming despite the unease she had stirred. The commander sat alone in his quarters, a single lamp burning low, his hands gripping an old book of records he had not opened in years. His eyes moved over sketches of the same crest that now burned on her back, over stories of warriors who were said to fight as if guided by foresight, who could sense the rhythm of battle before the first blade was drawn. He remembered how the elders had warned that if such blood ever returned, it would bring both hope and peril, for the world was not ready for the balance they once enforced. His chest tightened with a mix of dread and awe, for he knew now without doubt that the woman was no fraud. At dawn, when the recruits assembled again on the yard, they were quieter than usual, their energy subdued, their eyes often flicking toward her in a mix of curiosity and fear. The commander stepped out, his usual booming presence muted, and announced the day's drills with a voice that carried less arrogance than before. The woman joined every exercise without hesitation, never speaking, never boasting, yet every movement reminded them of yesterday's revelation. The recruits struggled harder, not because they were ordered to but because none of them wanted to be seen as weak before her now. Some glared at her, angry at the perhaps even admiration. Midway through the day the commander called her forward, his jaw tight. "Show me," he said simply, not explaining further, and though the recruits did not understand, she seemed to know exactly what he wanted. She stepped into the ring once more, this time facing him. A murmur went through the crowd. No recruit had ever sparred with the commander himself, for he was known to break bones to prove a point. The woman bowed her head slightly, calm, waiting. He lunged at her with a speed that made the air crack, his stick slicing toward her shoulder, yet she moved with liquid precision, her body flowing around his attack like water around stone. Again and again he struck, his power undeniable, his skill honed by decades of war, yet she evaded without panic, redirecting his momentum, never wasting energy. When finally he answered not with evasion but with a sudden movement so precise it was almost invisible, and the next moment he found himself disarmed, his stick tumbling to the ground, her hand poised as if it could strike but did not. The recruits gasped, some stepping back as though lightning had struck, and the commander himself froze, staring at her not with anger but with raw recognition. For a heartbeat the yard was silent, and then he straightened slowly, his breathing heavy, his eyes burning with something between fear and respect. "Enough," he said hoarsely, retrieving his stick, though his voice carried a weight that made it clear he was no longer in control of the situation. She stepped back calmly, lowering her stance as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The recruits, wide-eyed, could barely contain the storm of thoughts raging in their heads, and though none spoke, all understood that the woman who had arrived as a stranger now stood as something far greater. Later, as the sun dipped low again, the commander called her privately to his quarters, the others watching with held breaths as she followed him inside. When the door shut, he stood with his back to her for a long while, staring at the crest drawn in the book he had laid open on the table. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice low, "what is your purpose here?" She stepped closer, her eyes calm as always. "To remember," she said softly, "and to awaken what has been buried too long." The words chilled him, for he did not yet know whether they were a promise or a warning, but deep down he realized the fate of his command, and perhaps far more than that, was about to be rewritten by the presence of this woman with the tattoo of fire and wings on her back. The commander paced his quarters after her words, his boots dragging faint lines across the wooden floor as though he could wear out the confusion boiling in his chest, but she stood silently by the table, watching him, the eyes that made him feel as though she already knew his thoughts before he did. He wanted to dismiss her, to send her away from his camp before her presence unraveled everything he had built, yet every instinct sharpened by years of battle told him that driving her out would not erase her mark nor the truth she carried. At last he turned, his jaw set hard. "You think you can walk in here, show a mark the world has declared forbidden, and speak of awakening without consequence?" he asked, but his tone lacked the fire it once held, it trembled with something closer to fear. She did not blink. "I did not come to think, Commander," she replied, her voice steady. "I came because silence has gone on too long." His breath caught, because he could not deny the chill that ran through him at her words, as though she echoed some prophecy he had tried to forget. Outside, the saw cleaning their gear, but every ear strained toward the closed quarters, sensing that something larger than their drills was unfolding within those walls. The commander lowered himself into his chair heavily, rubbing his temples. "If what you carry is true, if you are who you claim to be, then you put not just this camp but the entire region in danger," he muttered. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across the old book of records. "Danger already lives here," she said softly, "but most are too blind to see it. I did not come to create it. I came to meet it." His eyes narrowed. "What danger?" She held his gaze without flinching. "The kind you train to fight but cannot see until it is too late. The kind that hunts in silence, behind banners of order and law, until only ashes remain." The commander's heart thudded painfully. Inside he recognized the truth in her voice, though he had no proof, only whispers he had ignored for years. He remembered old reports that had vanished mysteriously, names of comrades who disappeared when they asked too many questions, supply trains that went missing without explanation. He had buried his suspicions for survival's sake, but now here stood a woman whose very presence tore open wounds he had forced closed. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and for the first time his voice dropped into something almost vulnerable. "Why here? Why me?" She tilted her head slightly as if weighing her words. "Because you still remember," she said, and though he did not fully understand, he felt the truth strike deep, for he had never been able to erase the image of that crest from his mind, even when the world insisted it was gone. The room was thick with silence until he finally exhaled heavily, resigned. "Very well," he said. "But if you are to stay, you will do so." He expected her to resist, but she only gave a faint nod. "Then let the time come," she replied and turned to leave. As she opened the door, dozens of eyes snapped away, pretending they had not been listening, though the tension in the yard was thick enough to taste. She walked back across the training ground with the same quiet steps, her face unreadable, But the recruits' gazes followed her not with mockery now, but with questions they dared not voice. The commander remained behind, staring at the crest in his book, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the faded ink. He knew now that history had not ended where the records claimed, and that whatever storm she had spoken of was moving closer with every passing hour. That night, he lay awake, haunted not by dreams but by the image of her tattoo burning against the torchlight, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of destiny pressing against his shoulders like an unseen hand that would not release him. The following days in the camp were unlike any the recruits had ever known, for though the drills and orders remained the same, everything felt changed, as if the very air carried a different weight after her presence had been revealed, and where once there had been easy laughter and cruel mockery, now there was tension, curiosity, and even reverence laced with fear. Some recruits avoided her entirely, refusing to meet her eyes when they passed, while others watched her obsessively as if trying to decipher the secret of her movements, and though she rarely spoke, every action she took seemed to draw them in further, from the way she rose before dawn to run in silence, to the precise manner in which she cleaned and sharpened her training blade as though it were part of her very soul. The commander kept his distance at first, but the recruits noticed the difference. His voice carried less arrogance when it reached her, as if he himself acknowledged what she was, though he dared not say it aloud. On the fourth morning, a messenger arrived from the capital, a rider cloaked in the insignia of the higher command, bearing sealed letters. The commander read them in silence, his jaw tightening as his eyes moved across the words, and when he looked up, his gaze lingered briefly on her before sweeping across the camp. That evening he summoned the recruits, his expression grave. "Inspection," he announced, but his tone betrayed that this was no ordinary routine check. Whispers rushed through the ranks, for inspection by higher command meant scrutiny that could end careers, or worse, uncover things better left hidden. The woman stood still among them, her face calm, though her eyes flickered with a depth that made the commander uneasy. The next day 3 officers arrived in polished armor, their presence cold and sharp, and their questions sharper still. They moved down the line of recruits, examining weapons, questioning training progress, demanding answers with an edge of disdain, until finally their attention settled on her. One officer, tall and narrow-eyed, smirked as if delighted to find something unusual. "And who is this?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock amusement. The commander stiffened. "A recruit," he said quickly, too quickly, and the officer raised an eyebrow. "This one looks out of place." The woman met his gaze without flinching, and for a moment the officer faltered, unsettled by the calm depth of her eyes, but then his smirk returned and he circled her slowly. "Remove your tunic," he ordered, his tone casual but cruel. The commander's chest clenched, but before he could intervene she obeyed, pulling the fabric over her head with deliberate slowness. The moment the tattoo was revealed, silence crashed over the yard, thicker and heavier than before. The officers froze, their faces draining of color, and the narrow-eyed one staggered back half a step as if struck by an unseen blow. He recovered quickly, but his voice betrayed a tremor when he asked, "Where did you?" The commander stepped forward sharply, his hand raised. "Enough," he barked, his authority returning in a rare flare. "This recruit is under my command and requires no interrogation." The officers exchanged looks, their unease poorly hidden, and after a tense pause they moved on, though the narrow-eyed one glanced back at her more than once, his expression shifting from fear to calculation. When the inspection ended and the officers departed, the camp remained silent for a long while, the recruits processing what they had just witnessed, but the commander's mind was already racing. He had seen the terror in the officer's eyes, and he understood what it meant. The secret she carried was not unknown to the higher command, it was something they feared, something they perhaps thought erased from history, and now that it had returned they would not leave it alone. That night he called her to his quarters again, his face pale but determined. "They know," he said flatly. She nodded once as if she had expected it all along. "Of course they know," she replied quietly, "they buried the truth themselves." His breath caught, for the words confirmed suspicions he had never dared voice, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him with suffocating certainty. He knew then that her arrival was no accident, no mere twist of fate, it was the spark to a fire that had been waiting in silence, and once lit, it would consume far more than just his camp. That night, for though the recruits lay on their cots pretending to rest, the weight of what they had witnessed pressed on them like a heavy stone, and in the commander's quarters the lamp burned until dawn as he wrestled with the knowledge that the officers would not simply walk away and forget what they had seen, because men like that did not fear symbols without reason. The woman sat cross-legged in her own corner of the barracks, eyes closed, her breathing slow and even, as though she drew strength from silence itself, and when the horn sounded at first light she rose without hesitation, her body already alive with energy while the others dragged themselves wearily into formation. The commander barked the day's orders more harshly than usual, but it was clear to anyone watching that his anger was a mask for the storm inside him, for his eyes lingered on the horizon more than on the recruits, as though he expected riders to appear at any moment with chains and decrees. By midday, when sweat soaked the recruits and the yard baked under the sun, dust rising in choking clouds, the commander called for sparring drills, pairing them off in quick succession until one by one they collapsed, bruised and groaning. When her name was spoken, a hush fell because none dared volunteer against her now. Finally, the commander pointed to one of the camp's strongest, a brute of a man whose pride had been wounded by her victories days earlier. He stepped forward, his jaw clenched, determined to restore his honor. The fight began brutally. He attacked with a ferocity meant to overwhelm, striking with fists heavy as hammers, but she moved with that same uncanny grace, weaving through his blows, her body flowing like water that could not be grasped. The recruits gasped as he swung wildly, exhausting him, until at last she struck, not with cruelty but with precision, sending him crashing into the dust, unable to rise. The yard erupted in stunned silence once again, and though no one cheered, every eye shone with the unspoken recognition that she was something beyond them. The commander's mouth tightened, pride and dread warring inside him, and he dismissed the drill abruptly. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the uneasy calm. Riders appeared at the gates, not messengers this time but soldiers in the crest of the High Council, armored and stern, their arrival sending ripples of fear through the camp. The commander strode forward to meet them, his hand on his sword, while the recruits clustered at a distance, whispering furiously. The lead soldier dismounted, handed him a sealed parchment, and announced coldly that the council demanded the immediate transfer of the woman to the capital for questioning. The commander's jaw locked as he broke the seal and scanned the order, his eyes darkening with every word. Behind him, she stood silently, her face calm as ever, though her eyes flickered like embers in torchlight. At last he folded the parchment slowly, crumpling it slightly in his fist. "This recruit is under my command," he said in a low, firm voice, "and she will remain here until I say otherwise." The soldiers stiffened, their leader narrowing his eyes. "You defy the council?" he asked coldly. The commander's hand did not leave his sword. "I obey the law of my camp," he answered. A dangerous silence followed, broken only by the stamping of the horses, and then the lead soldier's lips curled in a thin smile. "Very well," he said, mounting again, "but the council does not forget defiance. They will return." With that, the riders wheeled their horses and thundered back into the darkening plain, leaving the camp in tense silence. The recruits turned wide eyes toward the commander, who remained staring at the horizon, the parchment still clenched in his hand. Finally he turned toward her, his voice hoarse when he said, "You've brought the storm to my gates." She met his gaze steadily, and for the first time her words carried a hint of fire. "The storm was already coming," she said, "I only refused to hide from it." The commander felt the weight of truth in her tone, and as night fell heavy over the camp, every man and woman inside knew that the days of ordinary drills were gone, and that their lives had been bound to something far greater than themselves, something written in ink and blood across the back of the woman they once called simple. The camp awoke the next morning under a sky heavy with gray clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the world, and though the horn sounded as usual and the recruits filed into the yard, their movements were stiff, their eyes darting nervously toward the gates as if expecting the council's riders to return at any moment with a larger force. Yet through all this tension she remained steady, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, and it was that composure which slowly began to weave itself into the others like a quiet thread of strength they had not known they needed. The commander's voice cracked across the yard, sharper than ever, ordering drills with a force meant to drive away the fear building inside his camp. But the harder he pushed, the more obvious it became that discipline alone would not hold them together. At midday, when the sun tried weakly to break through the clouds, he dismissed the formation and called her forward, not into the sparring ring but into the open space before the recruits, and his eyes burned with a question he had avoided too long. "You speak of silence ending," he said loudly enough for all to hear, "but what is it you intend to awaken? What truth is it that makes the council tremble?" His voice echoed through the yard, and though the recruits easily, all ears fixed on her, desperate for answers to the riddle she embodied. She did not hesitate, though her words came slow and deliberate, each one cutting through the heavy air. "The mark you saw is not only mine," she said, turning slightly so the crest was visible through the fabric of her tunic. "It belongs to a lineage sworn to guard what others sought to bury, a memory of war, yes, but also of betrayal." The recruits leaned forward as she continued, her tone calm but edged with steel. "Your council fears me not because of who I am, but because of what I know, that they were not the victors of the last war as they claim, but the usurpers, the ones who struck from the shadows and erased those who stood against their hunger for power. My people carried the truth into silence, scattered, hidden, waiting until the day it would be remembered again. That day is here." Gasps rippled through the crowd, others staring wide-eyed at the commander to see how he would respond. His face was pale, his jaw rigid, because deep down he recognized fragments of her words from the sealed records he had once glimpsed, records that had vanished soon after. He tried to steady his voice as he barked, "Dangerous claims, nothing more than treason spoken in riddles." But his tone rang hollow and even his recruits heard it. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on him. "You felt it when you saw the mark," she said softly, yet all could hear, "because you know the truth was never destroyed, only hidden. You know their fear is real." The commander's chest heaved, fury and fear clashing inside him, and for a moment he looked as though he might strike her down then and there to silence the storm she was stirring, but something in her gaze held him still, that calm certainty that seemed carved from stone. The recruits, once mere spectators, were now caught in the gravity of her words. Some looked terrified, others inspired, but none remained indifferent. A young recruit stepped forward suddenly, voice trembling but loud. "If what you say is true," he asked, "then what becomes of us?" Her gaze softened as she turned to him. "You must decide," she answered. "The path of silence or the path of truth. But know this, truth will not stay buried, and when it rises, those who tried to chain it will come with fire and steel." The yard went utterly still, the weight of her words pressing on every chest. The commander felt sweat at his temples despite the cool air, for he realized with dawning clarity that the choice was no longer his alone. The woman had planted seeds in the hearts of his recruits, and already they were beginning to shift. He dismissed the assembly abruptly, his voice hoarse, ordering them back to their barracks, but the silence that followed was heavier than any roar of discipline he had ever known. That night, he stood at the edge of camp staring at the horizon where the capital lay, and for the first time in his long career he felt the certainty that the true war was no longer out there in distant lands but here, in his own camp, in the presence of the woman whose tattoo had turned his world to ash and fire. The following months transformed everything about the camp and the soldiers inside it. Where once there had been whispers and mocking laughter, there was now a quiet reverence whenever she walked past. The simple woman who had arrived with plain clothes and a bowed head was no longer the subject of jokes. She was the one everyone watched in silence, the one whose presence demanded respect without her ever needing to ask for it. Her tattoo had become legend, but more than the ink etched into her skin, it was the way she carried herself. The mixture of humility and strength truly changed the air around her. The commanders no longer questioned her place, nor did they try to overshadow her. Instead, they consulted her in matters of strategy, leaned on her in moments of uncertainty, and even sought her presence in times of fear, for she had shown them that courage was not loud nor arrogant but steady and unshakable. Yet even with the new respect, she never changed her ways. She rose at dawn like before, trained alongside the youngest recruits, ate the same food in the same mess hall, and listened more than she spoke. That simplicity reminded them all that greatness did not always come with fanfare, and that sometimes the strongest leaders were those who didn't fight for power but carried it naturally in silence. But beneath her calm, a storm was brewing. Rumors spread beyond the camp, whispers of a woman with a sacred mark on her back, a symbol tied to ancient protectors of the land. Legends began to send spies, eager to know if the stories were true. One night as the soldiers slept, shadows moved around the perimeter. She had been restless and awake, walking near the edge of the camp, when she caught sight of them. Without hesitation she confronted the intruders. They were skilled, cloaked in darkness, blades in hand, yet her movements were sharper, honed by years of discipline and quiet training. The clash was silent but brutal, the steel of their knives glinting in the faint moonlight as she disarmed them one by one. By the time the alarm was raised, she had already subdued them, their weapons scattered, their fear obvious. When the soldiers arrived, they found her standing over the defeated intruders with nothing but her calm breath and steady eyes. The commander, watching her, realized once more that she was no ordinary recruit but someone destined to carry a weight far beyond the camp's walls. In the days that followed, The prisoners revealed that they had been sent by powerful men from distant regions who feared the reawakening of old legends. The tattoo on her back was not just a mark but a seal, a symbol tied to a forgotten oath of guardianship, and those who knew of it believed that her presence could inspire rebellion or unity, depending on how her story spread. The commander gathered the council and debated what should be done, but no matter what strategies were laid on the table, it was her voice that cut through the noise. She reminded them that fear grew in darkness, that secrecy would only make her tattoo more dangerous, and that if the truth was to be faced, it had to be faced openly. Against all tradition, she stood before the entire camp one evening, removed the cloth that covered her back, and revealed the tattoo once more in the firelight. She told them what little she knew, that the mark was not chosen by her, that it belonged to her family's forgotten lineage, and that while others might see it as a weapon, she saw it only as a reminder of responsibility. Her words, spoken without pride or drama, reached deeper than any speech the commanders had ever given. The soldiers did not see her as a symbol to be feared or worshipped, but as one of their own who bore a heavy burden with grace. The months turned into a year, and her legend spread not because she sought fame, but because every soldier who trained with her carried her story back to their families. Villagers spoke of her in hushed tones, children whispered about the woman with the sacred tattoo, and even rival armies began to wonder who she truly was. Yet she remained the same, quiet, disciplined, unassuming. When battles came, she fought not with reckless fury but with the steady presence that inspired those around her. Soldiers who once mocked her now charged into danger simply because she led them. Commanders who once doubted her now planned campaigns with her insight as their foundation. And through it all, she never allowed the mark on her back to become a weapon of pride. Instead, she wore it like a silent vow, unspoken but ever present. And so the woman who had entered the camp as a stranger, laughed at and underestimated, became something far greater than anyone expected. Not a queen, not a general, not a prophet, but something rarer. A reminder that true strength does not need to shout, that true respect cannot be forced, and that sometimes the greatest changes come from those who never sought them. She had walked into their lives quietly, with nothing but her resolve, and by the time her story spread across the land, she had become the thread that bound them together. The laughter that once greeted her arrival was long forgotten, replaced by a silence of awe and the unshakable loyalty of the sight of her tattoo, now carried pride in his heart whenever he looked at her, for he knew he had witnessed the rise of a legend born not of power or fear, but of a simple woman whose strength could not be denied. The end.